When his wife's body was barely in the ground, Daniel looked his father in the eye and said, "You can't bring Mom back, but my wife's birthday only comes once a year." That single sentence sliced deeper than the funeral itself, erasing decades of sacrifice in one breath. The next morning, as though nothing had happened, Daniel came knocking with a request. Bold, shameless, dripping with entitlement. His father sat there in silence, the sting of betrayal hardening into something far colder. What came next would turn grief into fury and leave Daniel begging for mercy. Stay tuned. The sun hung low over the cemetery, its pale light stretching across rows of headstones. But all he could see was the empty space where his son should have stood. His wife's casket rested in front of him, polished wood catching the gray light like it was mocking him with its permanence. Daniel's name had been printed neatly in the funeral program, a pallbearer, a son, a presence meant to honor the woman who had carried him into this world. But the chair stayed empty, and the whispers began. Friends leaned close to one another, voices hushed but sharp. They spoke of Daniel's career, his new house, his polished reputation, as though those successes excused what could never be excused. They wondered where he was, how he could not stand beside his father when the dirt began to fall on his mother's coffin. The father heard every syllable. Each murmur was a blade pressed deeper, each word a reminder that Daniel was admired by strangers, while failing the only woman who had never once failed him. Patricia, his late wife's sister, leaned forward at one point, her voice barely above a breath. "Where is Daniel?" she asked, her tone laced with disbelief. He forced his mouth to shape the answer, rehearsed and flat. "Important commitments." The words tasted like poison. His throat tightened as her eyes flickered with confusion, then pity. Pity was worse than judgment. It was a reminder that everyone there could see the betrayal as clearly as he could feel it. He gripped the folded program tighter, the paper dampening under the weight of his palm, trying to keep his expression from betraying the storm inside. When the pastor spoke of family bonds, eternal love, the ties that outlast death, the words rang hollow. He kept his head bowed, but his mind screamed. How could there be eternal love when his own son treated his mother's burial like an afterthought, no more important than a dinner reservation? Each shovel of dirt that struck the coffin was not just a ritual, it was a hammer driving home the truth he had refused to see. He had lost his wife to illness, but he was losing his son to something worse. Selfishness so profound it had devoured every ounce of decency she had instilled in him. He stood among 23 mourners, people who had cooked casseroles, trimmed hedges, and sat with his wife in her final weeks. People who understood loyalty better than her own child. They came with flowers and tears, while Daniel chose candles and champagne. The father felt their presence, but none of it filled the hollow space where Daniel should have stood. That emptiness pressed against him until it seemed larger than the coffin itself, a void that stretched from the cemetery grass all the way into his chest. As the ceremony ended, neighbors laid hands on his shoulder, offering words he barely heard. They praised Margaret, her kindness, her loyalty, her devotion to her family. He nodded, because nodding was easier than breaking down. In his mind, he could still see her face, the way she had smiled whenever Daniel's name was mentioned, even when the boy had missed her doctor appointments, even when he forgot her birthdays. She had defended him until the last breath left her body, insisting he was just busy, just finding his way. She had built him into a man in her heart, even if reality showed otherwise. He watched the casket lower, his knees threatening to give out, his fists clenched so tightly that his nails bit into his palms. He wanted Daniel there to see it, to feel the weight of finality, to hear the sound of dirt striking the wood. Instead, all Daniel would hear that day was music and laughter. The father's jaw tightened as the pastor closed the service with prayer. He kept his eyes fixed on the coffin, unwilling to meet the sympathetic glances of those around him. Sympathy was a luxury he could not stomach. What he felt was not just grief. It was the cold, bitter taste of abandonment. When the mourners began to leave, he lingered. The cemetery grew quiet, except for the scrape of a shovel in the distance. He stared at the mound of dirt rising slowly over the casket and thought about the promises they had made to one another 40 years ago. She had given him her life, her loyalty, and her trust. He had vowed to protect her, to keep their family whole. He had delivered on those promises, but their son had shattered them in one afternoon with a single absence. The father's chest ached with a heaviness words could not touch. Driving home, he gripped the wheel until his knuckles turned white. The passenger seat beside him sat empty, the spot where she had always insisted on sitting in her little Honda rather than his truck. She said it was better for the environment, but now the silence in that seat was louder than any engine. The radio clicked on automatically, her favorite song spilling into the car. He turned it off with a quick jab of his finger, unable to let the melody taint the memory of her humming it in their kitchen. The street looked unchanged when he pulled into the driveway. Manicured lawns, painted mailboxes, neighbors walking dogs. The world kept moving while his life had stopped. He turned the key, the familiar click of the lock reminding him of her hands, how she used to fumble with the ring when she was rushing. He stepped into the house, and the silence crashed over him. No humming from the kitchen, no clatter of dishes, no television murmuring in the background. Just the groan of the house settling around 40 years of memories. He loosened his black tie and sank into his armchair. The one she had always said clashed with her floral curtains. He had refused to replace it, stubborn as ever, and now those curtains would hang forever as her final victory. He glanced at their wedding photo on the mantel, her smile frozen in time, radiant and young in her grandmother's dress. He felt his throat close, remembering the promises made that day in Davenport. Promises kept, but not honored by the one person she had loved most. His gaze drifted to the Bible on her nightstand, the bookmark still wedged into Psalms. A note slipped free, her handwriting neat and deliberate. My dearest James, please don't let Daniel forget us. We gave him everything we had. I hope that was enough. He held the paper in shaking hands, reading her plea over and over, his stomach twisting with the cruel irony of it. She had hoped their sacrifices would mean something, but her funeral proved otherwise. He opened the closet and found the box she had hidden away. Report cards from kindergarten, photos from birthdays, every small success Daniel ever achieved carefully preserved. She had written little notes on each one, her pride glowing in ink. So proud. Our brilliant boy. He could see her handwriting, hear her voice, feel her faith in a son who could not even give her one final hour of respect. He sat on the edge of the bed with those papers spread around him, his shoulders shaking, not from tears, but from something colder. That night, the house creaked with the weight of its silence. He sat in the armchair until the dark gave way to dawn, his mind looping back to the empty space at the funeral. The whispers, the look on Patricia's face when she asked where Daniel was. Each memory pressed against him like a vice. But somewhere beneath the grief, something else stirred. It was not anger yet, not vengeance, just the faintest spark of clarity, the realization that love without respect becomes a weapon turned against you. As he stared into the morning light, he knew the funeral was not just the end of his wife's life. It was the end of the illusion he had carried for decades. His son was not the man she believed him to be, and that truth would not remain buried with her. What followed would change everything. He walked into the house, and the silence pressed in on him like a weight he couldn't shake. The air still carried her scent, faint perfume mixed with the lemon polish she used on the furniture every Saturday. He loosened his tie, dropped it onto the arm of the chair she had always hated, and drifted through the rooms like a man moving through the ruins of his own life. Every detail felt frozen in time, untouched since she had gone. Her coffee mug still sat in the dishwasher, a faint stain of lipstick on the rim. Her reading glasses lay neatly folded on the kitchen counter. He reached out to touch them, then stopped, the grief too raw to allow even that. In their bedroom, the bed was neatly made, her side still smoothed, as if she would return any moment. He opened the nightstand and found her Bible, the bookmarks tucked into the Psalms she read every morning. A folded note slipped out and fell onto the floor. His hands trembled as he bent to pick it up. "My dearest James, please don't let Daniel forget us. We gave him everything we had. I hope that was enough. All my love, M." He sank onto the edge of the bed, staring at the words until they blurred. His chest tightened as if her hand had reached from the grave to squeeze his heart, begging him to remember what she had spent her life fighting for. He moved to the closet and noticed a box tucked deep in the corner, a box he didn't recall seeing before. He pulled it out and set it on the floor. Dust clung to its edges, but the lid lifted easily. Inside, layers of memories waited, preserved with meticulous care. The first thing he found was a stack of report cards, beginning with kindergarten. His son's name written neatly at the top, little stars drawn in red ink by teachers. On each one, she had written small notes in the margins. "So proud. Our brilliant boy." He traced her handwriting with his finger, hearing her voice as clearly as if she were still in the room. Beneath the report cards were photographs. Daniel blowing out candles on a homemade cake, his cheeks round and eyes alight with joy. Margaret had stayed up until 2 a.m. decorating those cakes, scraping together money for balloons and streamers when they couldn't afford much else. Another picture showed Daniel in his cap and gown, smiling wide, the degree that had cost them more than $200,000 clutched in his hand. Margaret had worked double shifts at the diner for that smile. He had taken extra construction jobs on weekends until his back ached and his hands blistered. They had postponed anniversaries, skipped vacations, sacrificed doctor visits, all so their son could stand on that stage without worry. He pulled out a small envelope and found the receipts, carefully bundled and labeled. College tuition, graduate school fees, down payment for Daniel's first house, the lavish wedding to Olivia that had drained $75,000 from their savings. The amounts piled up in his mind, a mountain of numbers carved from their own lives. His wife had documented every dollar with the same precision she brought to every task, her handwriting small and steady in the margins. Anniversary dinner canceled. Needed $5,000 for Daniel's car repair. Postponed doctor visit. Sent money for Olivia's business. He pressed the notes to his forehead, closing his eyes against the sting. His heart ached, not just for the sacrifices themselves, but for the love behind them. She had never complained, not when he worked 16-hour days, not when they lived on macaroni and cheese for weeks. She had always said they were building Daniel's future, whispering those words when their son fell asleep between them in their bed. She believed in him with a faith so unshakable it had carried them both through years of hardship. That faith was what made her defend him even when the signs were clear. She had excused his absence at chemo treatments, brushed off his missed birthdays, clung to the idea that he was just busy building his own life. She had given him everything, right down to her final breath, believing he would one day rise to be the man she imagined. He sat surrounded by the evidence of her devotion, and grief twisted into something bitter. All those years of sacrifice had led to a single phone call where Daniel had chosen a party over his own mother's funeral. He stared at the photographs until his vision blurred, seeing not just his son as a child, but the man who had taken their love and turned it into entitlement. The contrast was unbearable, like looking at two different lives layered over one another. The boy with the chubby hands reaching for his mother's embrace, and the man who shrugged off her burial because champagne glasses and birthday decorations were more important. He stood, pacing the room, clutching one of the old photos. His wife's smile glowed in the picture, pride radiating from her eyes as she looked at their son. He felt the edges of the photograph bite into his hand as he gripped it tighter, the paper bending under the pressure. Her smile had been real, her pride genuine, and that made Daniel's betrayal even more unbearable. She had poured her heart into him, and he had given her nothing in return when it mattered most. He walked back to the desk and spread the papers out in a careful line, like evidence in a courtroom. Each sacrifice laid bare, each receipt a testimony of love. He picked up his calculator, the clicking keys echoing in the silent house as he added the numbers. The total grew higher with each entry, each memory, until the final figure glared back at him. Nearly $1 million. Nearly $1 million of their lives, spent not on themselves, not on dreams or comfort, but on a son who had walked away when they needed him most. The house grew darker as evening settled in, but he didn't turn on the lights. He sat in the armchair, surrounded by the ghosts of sacrifices past. The photo of Margaret smiling down from the mantel. He thought of her final note, her hope that Daniel would not forget them, that their love would be enough. He clenched the paper in his hand, his jaw tightening. It had not been enough. The grief was sharp, but beneath it, something harder began to form. He realized then that the funeral had not only buried his wife, it had buried the illusion he had carried for decades. He had believed, like Margaret, that love and sacrifice would shape Daniel into a man of character. But now he saw the truth. Sacrifice without gratitude only bred entitlement, and entitlement had hollowed Daniel out until there was nothing left but greed. He looked around the room at the evidence of their devotion, at the weight of what they had given, and felt a clarity settle over him. The pain of her absence was unbearable, but it was no longer the only thing he carried. There was resolve now, sharp and cold, a determination born from betrayal. He had spent his life giving. Now it was time to take back control. He closed the box, slid it back into the closet, and stood in the dim light of the bedroom. The air was heavy, but his steps felt steadier. He turned toward the desk, toward the files that documented not just Daniel's life, but the truth of who he had become. He knew this was only the beginning. The real reckoning had yet to come. And when it did, his son would finally understand the cost of betrayal. The desk was buried under stacks of papers, receipts, and bank statements, each one carrying the weight of a lifetime of sacrifice. He sat there in the dim light, calculator in hand, the steady clicking of the buttons filling the silence of the house, like the ticking of a clock counting down to judgment. Tuition payments, down payments, medical bills he had postponed so his son could have a new car, loans for businesses that never survived the year. All of it spilled across the desk in cold black ink. He added the numbers again, slower this time, as though dragging out the process might change the outcome. But the figure never shifted. Nearly $1 million. Not just money, their lives. Carved up, piece by piece, and handed to a boy who had grown into a man without conscience. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, the weight of the total pressing down on him like a physical force. $1 million could have bought them comfort in their old age, could have funded trips they had always postponed, could have paid for her medical care without compromise. Instead, it was gone, consumed, transformed into designer handbags, champagne parties, and a lifestyle that had no memory of where it came from. He saw her handwriting on the notes in the margins of bills, reminders of what they had given up. Anniversary dinner canceled. Needed money for Daniel's mortgage. Postponed doctor visit. Sent money for Olivia's business. Each line a wound carved into their lives, scars written in her careful script. He remembered the nights she worked double shifts at the diner, her feet swollen and her smile tired but still present when she walked through the door. He remembered coming home from 16-hour days on construction sites, his hands blistered, his back aching, only to hand over his paycheck so Daniel's tuition check wouldn't bounce. They had lived on macaroni and cheese for weeks, skipped anniversaries, bought generic groceries, all to make sure Daniel never felt the hunger or struggle they had known. And for what? For him to tell his father that his wife's birthday mattered more than his mother's funeral. His jaw tightened as he stared at the total glowing on the calculator screen. $847,000. Almost $1 million. He thought of his own father, a man who had given him nothing but the advice to build his own character. Build your own future, he had said, and James had done just that. He had built a business with his bare hands, built a family, built a life worth living. And then he had dismantled it himself, spoon-feeding every ounce of it to a son who saw generosity not as love, but as entitlement. The bitterness rose in his chest like bile. He looked around the study, at the wedding photo on the mantel, at her smile frozen forever, and felt the fury twist inside him. She had believed their sacrifices would be enough, that one day their son would recognize what they had given and honor it. But the funeral proved her wrong. He had not come. He had chosen laughter, music, and champagne over the mother who had given him everything. Nearly $1 million had bought them nothing in return. He slammed the calculator down on the desk, the plastic cracking under the force. The sound echoed through the empty house, sharp and final. He stood and paced the room, his hands restless, his chest heaving with the fury he had tried to bury under grief. He saw Daniel's face in his mind, smiling as he took the down payment for his first house, grinning as he walked down the aisle in a wedding funded by his parents, nodding with gratitude when they bailed him out of another failed business venture. Gratitude that had never lasted beyond the moment the check cleared. The truth settled over him like ice, like he and Margaret had been nothing more than a bank account to their son. Every sacrifice had been a withdrawal from the life they could have lived, every dollar a piece of themselves they would never get back. And when the account was finally empty, when all that remained was love and loyalty, Daniel had shown how little those things mattered to him. He sank back into the chair, staring at the files scattered before him. He thought of Margaret's note, her plea that Daniel never forget them, her hope that their love had been enough. His eyes burned as he whispered to the empty room, "It wasn't enough, Margaret. It was never enough." The silence answered him, heavy and merciless. The bitterness coiled tighter, but within it was something sharper, something more dangerous, a clarity he had not felt in years. He realized that the cost was not just financial. The true cost was the illusion they had carried, the belief that sacrifice alone could shape a man's character. The evidence before him proved otherwise. Sacrifice without accountability had bred only arrogance. Love without boundaries had created a monster. He gathered the papers into neat stacks, aligning them with precise movements. His hands no longer trembled. Each receipt, each record, was not just a reminder of loss. It was evidence, a ledger of betrayal. He saw it clearly now. This was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of one. The $1 million they had poured into Daniel's life was not a gift. It was a debt he intended to collect, not in dollars, but in something far more valuable. He switched off the desk lamp, plunging the room into darkness. The glow of the calculator screen faded, but the numbers remained burned into his mind. 847,000. A figure too heavy to ignore, too sharp to forget. He walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street. The world unchanged while his life had been torn apart. The bitterness hardened into resolve. He had spent his life giving. Now it was time to start taking back. Tomorrow he would begin, and when he did, Daniel would learn that debts like these are never forgiven. They are paid one way or another. The morning light filtered through half-drawn curtains, dull and gray, as if the sky itself refused to shine on a world that had just buried Margaret. He sat at his desk, the papers from the night before still spread across the surface, like evidence in a trial, when the phone began to ring. He glanced at the screen. Daniel. For a brief second, hope flickered, a foolish hope that his son might finally say the words he had been waiting to hear. An apology, a moment of shared grief, a recognition of what had been lost. He picked up the call, bracing himself. Daniel's voice burst through the line, cheerful, casual, completely detached from the weight of the funeral only hours before. "Hey, Dad. Hope you're doing okay after yesterday." The words were shallow, rehearsed, his tone the same one he used when he needed a favor. There was no mention of his mother's name, no acknowledgement of the casket, the prayers, the silence where he should have stood. Instead, Daniel cleared his throat, as though what he was about to ask was just routine business. "Listen, I need some help. The party went great, but we kind of overspent. We're looking at about $15,000 in immediate bills. Can you wire it today?" The word struck harder than any blow. $15,000. The day after his mother's funeral. For a party. For balloons, champagne, and a live band. His hand tightened around the receiver until the plastic groaned. He could hear Olivia's voice in the background, shrill and insistent, urging Daniel to tell him about the band, about the steakhouse, about the diamond bracelet. They wanted him to pay for their extravagance while Margaret's grave was still fresh with flowers. He stared at the photograph on his desk, his wife's smile captured forever in a frame. His throat closed as he thought of the years she had given up everything for Daniel. The note she had left him resurfaced in his mind. "Please don't let Daniel forget us." He closed his eyes, hearing her voice, her faith in their son, and felt the fury rise. All those years of sacrifice, all the money, all the love, and this was what remained. A phone call asking for $15,000 less than 24 hours after she had been lowered into the ground. Something hardened inside him, the grief, the sorrow, the endless disappointment, it all condensed into a single sharp edge. He had never told Daniel no, not once. Every request, every demand, every reckless mistake had been met with another check, another sacrifice, another excuse. But not this time. His voice was steady, colder than he expected when he finally spoke. "No." Silence filled the line. Daniel's tone shifted instantly, the cheerful mask slipping into irritation. "What do you mean, no? Is there a problem with the bank?" The entitlement dripped from every word, as if the idea of refusal had never crossed his mind. For 35 years it hadn't. But today was different. "I said no," James repeated, each word deliberate, final. "I won't be giving you any more money." The disbelief on the other end quickly turned to anger. "Are you seriously saying no to me after everything we've been through this week?" Everything we've been through. As if Daniel had stood beside him at the funeral. As if he had carried the weight of Margaret's death instead of sipping champagne at a birthday party. "You're 35 years old," James said flatly. "That has everything to do with it." Olivia's voice rose in the background, sharp and demanding. "Tell him we need that money. We already spent it." Daniel's breathing grew heavy, his voice trembling with practiced manipulation. "Mom would want you to help us. She'd want you to keep the family together." For years, those words would have worked. They would have cut deep, summoned guilt, forced another sacrifice. But not anymore. "Your mother wanted you at her funeral," James said, the steel in his tone unshakable. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by Olivia's angry shouting. Daniel tried again, softer this time, the desperation seeping through. "Fine. We'll figure it out ourselves. But don't expect us to come around much anymore if this is how you're going to be." The threat hung in the air, familiar and worn, the same one he had wielded countless times before. His presence for a price, his absence as punishment. James felt no fear this time, only clarity. "I understand," he said calmly, and hung up before Daniel could answer. The phone sat silent on the desk, no longer a leash around his neck. For the first time in decades, he had ended the conversation on his terms. He leaned back in the chair, staring at the papers spread before him, at the total nearly $1 million of sacrifice, love, and hope wasted. The bitterness burned. But beneath it was something else. Strength. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street bathed in morning light. The world seemed unchanged, but inside him something had shifted permanently. He had drawn a line that could not be erased. His son had revealed himself fully, and now James knew the truth. This wasn't just about money. It was about dignity. It was about justice for Margaret, for the years she had given, for the faith she had carried until her last breath. He turned back to the desk, his gaze falling on the files that documented every sacrifice, every indulgence granted, every request answered. The evidence was undeniable, and now he saw it with new eyes. This was not just a history. It was a record of weakness. His weakness. He had allowed Daniel to consume their lives unchecked. That ended today. The silence in the house no longer felt oppressive. It felt like preparation, like the pause before the storm. He knew what needed to come next. It was not enough to say no once. It was not enough to cut him off financially. Daniel had lived too long under the illusion of power, the illusion that his parents' sacrifices were his entitlement. That illusion had to be destroyed completely. James closed the files with deliberate precision, stacking them neatly as though preparing for court. Tomorrow, he thought, his son would learn the difference between being a son and being a dependent. He would no longer be shielded, no longer protected by excuses or loyalty. The next conversation they had would not be between father and son. It would be between a man who had built everything with his own hands and the boy who had wasted it all. As evening settled over the house, he sat in Margaret's chair by the window, her journal resting on his lap. He traced the cover with his fingers, feeling her presence in the pages, and whispered to the empty room. "You were right, Margaret. We gave him everything. But it's time to take it back." The house creaked softly in the night, the old walls shifting as if they understood the weight of his decision. For the first time since the funeral, James felt steady, anchored. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of something new, a reckoning long overdue. And when it came, Daniel would learn that a father's silence is not weakness. It is the calm before a storm that changes everything. The city was still waking when he pushed through the glass doors of Foster Construction. The morning air sharp against his face, his steps measured, unyielding. For years, he had entered this building as both a father and an employer. The lines blurred, his son's failures buried under excuses and Margaret's endless pleas for patience. But not today. Today he crossed the marble lobby not as a grieving widower weighed down by sorrow, but as a man stripped clean of illusions, a businessman with a ledger of debts ready to be collected, The receptionist looked up, startled by his early arrival. He gave her a brief nod and headed straight for his office, the click of his shoes echoing in the quiet hallway. He passed the framed photographs of completed projects, steel towers and polished complexes that bore his name, achievements built brick by brick through decades of sweat and sacrifice. Daniel's smile stared out from one of the frames, captured at a ribbon-cutting ceremony, confident and hollow. For the first time, James saw it clearly for what it was. Borrowed pride, a mask worn by someone who had done nothing to earn it. Inside his office, the blinds were half drawn, streaks of pale light falling across the mahogany desk. He sat down, spreading Daniel's personnel file across the surface, like evidence prepared for trial. Page after page revealed the truth he had refused to see. Missed deadlines, contractor complaints, inflated expense reports, clients quietly moved to other managers because Daniel's charm wore thin under scrutiny. 8 years of negligence documented in black and white, tolerated only because the man at the top had been blinded by love and loyalty. He picked up a report, the words blurring for a moment before sharpening into clarity. He remembered covering for Daniel after a client threatened to pull their contract, smoothing it over with promises and discounts that cost the company thousands. He remembered excuses whispered late at night to Margaret when she worried out loud. "He's still learning," she would say, her voice soft, her faith unshaken. But the papers before him told the truth Margaret had never wanted to face. Daniel hadn't been learning. He had been coasting. His fingers tightened around the folder until the edges bent. Enough. The word echoed in his mind like a gavel striking wood. Enough wasted money. Enough humiliation. Enough blind protection. He had buried his wife with dignity while his son drank champagne. He would not bury his company in the same way. He pressed the intercom button and called for Sarah Mitchell, the head of HR, a woman who had been with the company nearly as long as he had. When she stepped into his office, her face betrayed no surprise. She had been waiting for this moment, her own files already thick with documentation. He explained his decision with a voice stripped of hesitation. Termination. Effective immediately. Standard protocol. Security escort. Sarah nodded, her eyes steady, as though she had expected nothing less. She promised the paperwork would be ready within the hour. As she left, James stood and faced the mirror on the far wall. He studied his reflection, the lines etched deeper since the funeral, the weight of years carried in his shoulders. Yet beneath the grief there was steel, a clarity that had eluded him for decades. He practiced the words he would deliver, his tone even, professional, devoid of emotion. His son would not face his father that morning. He would face his employer, and his employer had run out of patience. At 9:30, Daniel strolled into the building, 15 minutes late as usual, a paper cup of coffee in hand, laughter spilling from his mouth as he joked with the receptionist. James listened from his office, his jaw tight, as if the sound itself mocked everything he and Margaret had endured. Daniel lingered by the coffee machine, casual, entitled, unaware that the ground beneath his feet was about to give way. James pressed the intercom again, his voice carrying across the lobby with a finality that turned heads. "Daniel, please come to my office immediately." There was a pause, then Daniel's lazy reply drifted back. "Sure, Dad. Just let me grab my coffee." James's voice cut sharper this time. "Now, Daniel." The silence that followed told him his son had heard the change. Moments later, Daniel stepped into the office, his casual smile faltering when he saw Sarah seated with a stack of papers. His brow furrowed, confusion flickering in his eyes. "What's with the setup?" he asked, his voice straining for lightness. James gestured to the chair across the desk. "Sit." Daniel obeyed, his smirk uncertain now, his eyes darting between Sarah and his father. James folded his hands on the desk, the termination letter placed neatly in front of him. Daniel, your employment with Foster Construction is terminated effective immediately. The words dropped like stones, the silence that followed heavier than the air itself. Daniel let out a laugh, forced and brittle. Very funny, Dad. What's this about? James slid the papers across the desk. Please review these documents and sign where indicated. The color drained from Daniel's face as his eyes scanned the legal text. His fingers twitched, his voice breaking into disbelief. You can't be serious. This is our family business. James's tone remained level, cold, professional. This decision is based on your work performance and professional conduct. Your position has been eliminated due to restructuring. Daniel's charm cracked into desperation. Look, I'm sorry about the money thing. We can work this out. We always do. James pressed the security button, his face unreadable. This is a business decision, not a personal one. The door opened and Mike Thompson from security stepped inside, his stance professional, his expression firm. Daniel's voice rose, frantic now, his words tumbling into pleas. Mom wouldn't want this. You know she wouldn't. He leaned forward, trying to pierce his father's armor with guilt. James didn't flinch. This isn't about what your mother would want. This is about what you've done. Daniel's hand shook as he gathered his belongings, his coffee mug, a photograph of Olivia in a silver frame. The weight of humiliation settled over him as his co-workers gathered in the hallway, whispering as the boss's son was escorted out like any other failed employee. His face flushed red, his eyes darting, searching for sympathy that never came. James watched from behind his desk, his hands steady, his breathing calm. For the first time in decades, he had acted not out of love or fear, but out of principle. The office door closed, and silence filled the room once again. He turned toward the window, the city stretching out before him, its steel and glass gleaming in the morning sun. He knew this was only the beginning. Termination was not the end of Daniel's influence. Not yet. But it was the first cut, the first fracture in the illusion his son had lived under for far too long. There would be more to come, and each step would strip Daniel further of the entitlement he had worn like armor. James stood, straightened his jacket, and walked to the wall where photographs of the management team hung in neat rows. He reached for Daniel's portrait, the smiling face that no longer belonged, and pulled it down. He placed it face down in a drawer, the empty space on the wall cleaner, sharper, truer. The hardest part was done. The reckoning had begun. And soon, Daniel would learn that a father's patience is finite, but a businessman's resolve is absolute. Daniel stood in front of the desk, the paper trembling in his hands, his voice cracking with disbelief. You can't do this, Dad. This is my future, my career. James didn't move, his expression carved from stone, his voice even. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot, final and irreversible. Daniel's forced smile collapsed into something raw, a desperation he could no longer hide. He leaned forward, his tone shifting, pleading. Look, I know I've made mistakes. We can fix this. Just give me another chance. For years, those words had been enough to melt James's resolve. Not anymore. This time, the armor of excuses shattered on impact. Before Daniel could say more, the office door burst open. Olivia stormed in, her heels clicking hard against the floor, her face flushed with rage. She didn't wait for permission, didn't acknowledge Sarah from HR or the security guard who had already stepped closer. How dare you humiliate him like this, she snapped, pointing an accusatory finger at James. We have bills to pay. We've built a life around this job. You owe us. James remained seated, hands folded on the desk, his voice calm in the face of her fury. This is a private workplace. You need to leave." Her laugh was sharp, venomous. "Leave. You destroy his career, strip him of his livelihood, and expect us to walk away quietly. You can't just erase your own son." James met her glare without blinking. He is an employee, and he is being treated as one. Nothing more. Olivia turned to Daniel, her words loud enough for everyone in the hallway to hear. "He's losing his mind. This is elder abuse. Margaret would be ashamed of you." That name, spoken with such cruelty, sent a cold fury through James's veins. But his face remained unreadable. He pressed the security button, his tone steady. "Escort them both out." The guards stepped forward, their presence filling the office, their professionalism unshaken by Olivia's shrieks. She clawed at the air with accusations, shouting about lawsuits, demanding severance, threatening to drag the company through the mud. Daniel's face burned with humiliation, caught between his wife's hysteria and his father's silence. He grabbed his coffee mug, a photo of Olivia in a silver frame, and shoved them into his bag. His hands shook as he tried to keep his dignity, but there was none left to salvage. The hallway had grown crowded, employees drawn by the commotion. They whispered to one another, their eyes wide as they watched the boss's son escorted like a criminal from the building that had once been his playground. Olivia's voice carried down the corridor, each insult slicing the air. "You'll regret this. You think you can just cut us out? We'll take everything you have." The guards held the door open, their faces impassive as they guided the couple out into the daylight. Daniel's shoulders hunched, his steps heavy, his pride bleeding out with every glance from his coworkers. Back in the office, the silence was thick, broken only by the sound of Sarah gathering the remaining papers. James exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest easing for the first time in years. He had done it. He had ended the cycle of excuses, severed the leash of entitlement, and taken control. For the first time in decades, the conversation had ended on his terms. He stood and walked to the wall of framed photographs. His hand hovered over Daniel's picture, the smile frozen in time, the suit he had paid for, the illusion of competence that had fooled no one but his wife. He lifted it down and turned it face down in the drawer. The empty space on the wall looked cleaner, sharper, honest. His reflection in the glass was not that of a grieving father anymore, but of a man who had chosen justice over sentiment. Outside the office, whispers spread through the building. Employees who had suffered under Daniel's negligence exchanged glances of relief. They had seen the files, heard the complaints, borne the consequences. Now they had witnessed the reckoning. Foster Construction, once shadowed by favoritism, stood cleansed. James returned to his desk, the city skyline stretching beyond the window. The sun was brighter now, the weight of compromise lifted from his shoulders. His phone buzzed with messages he ignored. Olivia's threats, Daniel's desperate calls, all irrelevant. The balance of power had shifted, and he was no longer the man who caved under guilt. He sat in silence, the hum of the office carrying on around him, and felt something he had not known in years. Triumph. Not the sweet kind, but the painful clarity of justice served, the acknowledgement that love had been wasted, but strength remained. He leaned back in his chair, eyes on the horizon, and thought of Margaret. She would have wept to see this day, but she would have understood. He whispered her name under his breath, a vow carried on the stillness of the room. No more weakness, no more indulgence. The reckoning had only just begun, and what came next would strip away the last illusions of family Daniel clung to. The father had buried his wife with sorrow. Now he would bury his son's entitlement with precision. The storm was not over. It was only gathering strength. The ink on the termination papers had barely dried when he walked into the tallest building in Davenport, leather briefcase in hand. The law offices of Chen and Associates occupied the top floor, all mahogany trim and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. He had known Robert Chen for 20 years, trusted him with incorporations, contracts, and delicate matters. But today was different. Today was not business. Today was legacy. Robert rose from behind his desk, sympathy softening his face. "How are you holding up, James?" The question lingered, but James waved it away. "I need to make changes to my estate." Robert assumed he meant routine updates after Margaret's passing, shifting beneficiaries, smoothing paperwork. But when James pulled out the documents, his voice carried the weight of finality. "I'm removing Daniel entirely." Robert froze, his composure slipping for the first time in their long relationship. James laid out his vision with deliberate calm. A foundation in Margaret's name, scholarships for underprivileged children, funding for cancer research, the causes she had championed while alive, the causes she never stopped speaking about, even as her strength faded. Robert leaned forward, pen poised, eyes searching. "James, are you certain? These decisions can't be undone." James's answer came without hesitation. "I've never been more certain of anything." He opened the files, showing the meticulous records of every dollar Daniel had drained from their lives. Tuition, weddings, houses, failed ventures, endless loans, almost $1 million. He recounted the funeral, the absence, the phone call demanding $15,000 the next morning. Robert's jaw tightened with each detail, his sympathy shifting into something darker, understanding. The papers rustled as they prepared the new will. Daniel was not simply omitted, he was explicitly excluded. His name, once written into every clause of their future, was erased with deliberate precision. The Margaret Foster Memorial Foundation would take its place, an institution born not of revenge, but of justice, shaped from grief into purpose. James outlined every detail, from the structure of the board to the first year's initiatives. He spoke of scholarships that would carry children through college, research grants that might save lives. He spoke with the energy of a man who had found direction in the ashes of betrayal. "Margaret would be proud," Robert said softly, his pen scratching across the parchment. "She always believed in giving back." James allowed himself a small nod. This was the first decision since her death that felt like honor instead of loss. Each signature he scrawled steadied him further, each document pulling him away from bitterness and toward something enduring. The foundation would not only carry her name, it would carry her values, untainted by the greed that had hollowed out their son. When the witnesses entered, James signed with a steady hand. The ceremony was formal, clinical, yet to him it felt sacred. Each stroke of ink severed Daniel from his inheritance and replaced him with something purer. The ring on his finger glinted in the light as he pressed his name into permanence, Margaret's memory guiding his hand. The lawyers notarized, stamped, and filed, their efficiency wrapping his decision in legality. It was done. Daniel was no longer heir to their fortune. His future with them ended the moment he chose champagne over his mother's grave. James leaned back, a strange calm washing over him. The bitterness that had consumed him at the funeral, the fury that had driven him to say no, the cold resolve that ended Daniel's employment, all of it shifted into something lighter. Purpose. He saw Margaret's face in his mind. Her smile when she spoke about helping others, her quiet joy when she slipped cash into the church donation box. This was her legacy, not the waste and entitlement that had poisoned their son. Robert pressed the final folder closed and looked across the desk. "There's more we can do. Power of attorney, medical directives. Remove Daniel's authority entirely." James agreed instantly. They drafted documents stripping Daniel of any future claim. not just to wealth, but to influence. Healthcare decisions, retirement accounts, insurance beneficiaries, every thread that once tied Daniel to their lives was cut clean. By the end of the meeting, the boy who had drained them for decades had been erased from every legal corner of his father's world. When James left the office, the sun was breaking through the clouds, glinting off the river. His phone buzzed with missed calls, Daniel's name flashing again and again. He ignored them. He walked to his car lighter, his briefcase heavy with documents that sealed not just an inheritance, but a reckoning. He drove through Davenport's quiet streets, past the homes he had helped build, past the church where Margaret's choir once sang. For the first time in weeks, his chest did not ache with grief alone. It carried something sharper, prouder. That night he sat at his dining table, the documents neatly stacked beside Margaret's journal. He read her entries aloud, her hopes, her fears, her endless love for a son who had never earned it. He closed the book gently and looked at the papers. "Justice," he whispered, and felt the words settle into the silence. Not revenge, not cruelty, justice. He poured himself a glass of bourbon, the same bottle Daniel had once demanded he bring to a party, and raised it toward Margaret's photo. "To you, my love, to your memory, to what comes next." He drank deeply, the burn anchoring him to the moment. Tomorrow he would meet with the bank, begin transferring accounts into the foundation, cut the last financial ties that bound him to Daniel. The process had begun, and there would be no turning back. As the clock ticked past midnight, James stood at the window, watching the street lamps glow against the dark. He thought of Daniel, of Olivia, of the house bought with his money, the lifestyle built on their sacrifices. He thought of how fragile it all really was, propped up on the illusion of endless generosity. He smiled, cold and certain. That illusion was gone now. The foundation was built on firmer ground, and soon his son would learn what it meant to stand without it. He turned from the window, the house silent, but no longer suffocating. For the first time since the funeral, he felt something close to peace. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, anger, perhaps even threats. But tonight, in the quiet glow of Margaret's memory, he felt strong. The reckoning was underway, and justice was no longer a distant idea. It was alive, written in ink, signed, sealed, and ready to outlast them all. The next battle would not be fought in boardrooms or bank offices. It would be fought in the very fabric of their community, where legacy meant everything. And Daniel, stripped of his place, was about to discover just how far his fall would go. The collapse began quietly, like a hairline crack spreading through glass. Invisible at first, but inevitable once it started. Davenport had always been a town that prized appearances, a place where reputations could carry a man further than his talent. For years, Daniel and Olivia had floated on borrowed prestige, their names whispered in country club corridors with admiration, their faces welcomed at luncheons and charity galas. But word travels fast in small circles, and when the story of Daniel's absence from his mother's funeral reached the right ears, admiration curdled into disgust. It started with whispers at the country club, polite but cutting. Where was Daniel at the service? Surely he had a reason. But when the truth came out, that he had chosen his wife's birthday party over his mother's burial, there was no salvaging their image. The Bridge Club wives spread the story with righteous precision, each retelling sharpening the shame. By the end of the week, Daniel's lunch invitation had been rescinded, his golf foursome dissolved into awkward excuses, and Olivia was politely asked to leave her yoga class mid-session. The instructor's words were clipped and merciless. "We prefer members with family values." Olivia's fury grew with every door that closed. Romano's, their favorite restaurant, suddenly had no tables available. Bergdorf's boutique rejected her credit application. The sales associates offering thin smiles instead of champagne. Even the salon canceled her appointment, leaving her standing humiliated in the lobby while other women whispered behind manicured hands. The world she had built on status and performance was crumbling, brick by brick, and there was no one to hold it up. Daniel fared no better. Potential employers who once returned his calls now kept their distance. Job interviews ended before they began, each interviewer already aware of the funeral scandal. Contractors he had mistreated at Foster Construction spread the word further, reminding anyone who would listen of his arrogance, his negligence, his failures. He was no longer the heir to a respected company. He was the man who abandoned his mother's grave for a party. And Davenport had no room for that kind of man. The financial pressure came next, swift and merciless. Mortgage payments slipped, bills piled up, and the safety nets James had once provided were gone. One meeting at the bank ended the guarantees that had shielded Daniel for years, and within weeks foreclosure papers arrived at the door of the house he had once paraded as his crowning achievement. Olivia screamed, throwing envelopes across the kitchen, demanding Daniel fix it, demanding he call his father, beg him, threaten him, anything. But every call went unanswered. Every door they pushed against stayed locked. The BMW was the first to go, repossessed in broad daylight, the neighbors watching from their windows as Daniel pulled golf clubs and personal items from the trunk under the repo man's stare. Olivia sobbed in the driveway, her fury turning against him in sharp accusations. "You've destroyed us. You let this happen." Their arguments grew louder, spilling into the street, their humiliation complete under the gaze of those who once envied them. Inside the house, the power company shut off the lights. Candles flickered against designer wallpaper, their once perfect home reduced to shadows and silence. Olivia's heels clicked furiously across the hardwood as she paced, spitting blame in every direction but her own. Daniel sat slumped at the kitchen table, staring at the final notices, the red ink screaming what he could no longer deny. He had built nothing. Everything he had was borrowed, stolen, or gifted. And now it was gone. Their marriage cracked under the strain. Olivia's contempt grew with every missed payment, every humiliation, until her words became knives. "I didn't marry a failure. I married into a family with money." When the credit cards were declined and the boutique doors closed, she turned colder, reminding him of her ex-boyfriend who owned restaurants, who would never have let her fall this low. The day she packed her bags, her voice was almost gleeful. "Your father was right about us." She left with barely a glance back, the slam of the door sealing the collapse of what little life they had left together. Daniel's desperation deepened into something hollow. He pawned Olivia's jewelry, sold the golf clubs, held a garage sale where wedding gifts bought for hundreds sold for $20. Old friends drove by, slowed, then accelerated without stopping. His humiliation was complete when he stood in the yard, bargaining with strangers over silverware and crystal vases once displayed proudly in their dining room. Each piece gone was another reminder of what he had squandered, of what had been taken from him not by cruelty, but by consequence. James watched from a distance, never intervening, never softening. He drove past once, the sight of Olivia's fury spilling into the street like a performance for the neighborhood. He felt no pity, only the cold satisfaction of justice. Margaret had always said actions have consequences, and now her son was learning that truth with brutal clarity. When the foreclosure auction arrived, Daniel stood on the courthouse steps, his shoulders hunched, Olivia gone, his world dismantled. He watched strangers bid on the house he had once boasted about, his eyes darting in panic as numbers rose. When his father's attorney appeared, calm and precise, representing a new LLC, realization dawned too late. The house was sold, the gavel struck, and Daniel's knees nearly buckled under the weight of his ruin. From across the street, James sat in his car, the black sedan blending with traffic, binoculars steady in his hands. He saw his son crumble, saw the life he had built on lies dissolve into nothing, and felt the satisfaction of truth finally revealed. This was not revenge. It was balance, justice unfolding one step at a time. By the end, Daniel lived in a small apartment above a laundromat, working for minimum wage at a gas station. His once pristine suits replaced by stained uniforms. He kept his head down, avoided the stares of those who remembered. He had become invisible in the same community that once admired him. Even then, when he looked at his father with hollow eyes, there was still a flicker of entitlement, a hope that somehow the checks would start again. But the foundation carried Margaret's name now, not his, and there was no place left for him in the legacy he once believed was his birthright. Justice had unfolded with surgical precision, stripping Daniel of everything he had taken for granted. The community had turned its back. The money was gone. The marriage dissolved. The house repossessed. All that remained was the shadow of a man who had squandered love, loyalty, and sacrifice. And James, standing at the center of it all, felt the dark satisfaction of knowing that his son's downfall was not punishment, but the simple, inevitable result of choices made. The reckoning was complete, but the story was not yet over. The final confrontation still waited, a reckoning not of wealth or reputation, but of blood, love, and the truth Margaret had carried to her grave. The cemetery was quiet, the air cool with the faint sweetness of cut grass, when James walked the familiar path toward the headstone. A year had passed since he had stood here broken, the coffin sinking into the earth, his son's absence louder than the hymns. Now his steps carried a steadiness that grief had once stolen. In his hand was a bundle of daisies, Margaret's favorite, simple and unpretentious. A flower that matched her heart more than any bouquet of roses ever could. He knelt and laid them gently against the stone, brushing away a stray leaf that had settled across her name. He spoke softly, his voice carrying only to her. "It's been a year, Margaret. A year of endings and beginnings." He told her about the foundation, how the Margaret Foster Memorial Fund had given scholarships to 12 students already, children who would never have afforded college otherwise. He described the letters they had sent, their gratitude raw and unpolished, filled with hope for futures that once seemed out of reach. He told her about the research grant to a team working on advanced cancer treatments, the kind she had prayed for in her final months. "You're still helping people," he whispered, "even now." The wind stirred the branches above, sunlight flickering across the stone. For the first time since lowering her into the ground, he felt that her presence was not just memory, but continuation. The foundation had become her voice, her touch, her legacy living on in ways neither of them could have imagined when they sat late at night at the kitchen table worrying about bills. He closed his eyes, hearing her laugh in the faint rustle of leaves, her words in the soft hum of the breeze. He thought of Daniel then, of the wreckage left behind, the foreclosure, the repossessions, Olivia leaving with nothing but venom in her voice, the community's doors closing, the admiration turning to contempt. Justice had not been swift, but it had been sure. James had not lifted a hand in cruelty. He had only removed the crutches that propped up his son's illusions. The fall had been inevitable. Daniel was a ghost in Davenport now, a man no one mentioned, his absence no longer needing explanation. James did not linger on him long. The bitterness had burned itself out months ago, leaving behind only the cool ashes of acceptance. His son had made his choices. Margaret's love had given him every chance, and his betrayal had carved his own path. There was nothing more to do, nothing left to take, no anger worth carrying. He placed his hand on the stone, fingers tracing her name, and let the calm wash over him. He told her about the house too, how he had sold their old home and given the proceeds to the foundation, how the new owners had kept the garden just as she had left it. He smiled faintly at the thought of her daisies still blooming there each spring, her work continuing quietly in soil and sunlight. He described the faces of the students he had met, their wide-eyed gratitude, their determination to make something of themselves. One young woman had clutched her scholarship letter like it was salvation, tears streaming down her cheeks as she promised to become a nurse. Margaret would have loved that moment. She would have held the girl's hands and told her to keep going, no matter how hard it got. As the sun climbed higher, James sat on the grass, the cool earth grounding him. For months after her death, he had felt untethered, adrift in bitterness and rage. But now, sitting in the quiet presence of her memory, he felt something entirely different. Peace. It was not the absence of pain. He knew the ache of her absence would never leave. But it was the presence of something steadier, deeper. Purpose. The knowledge that their sacrifices had not ended in vain. That her name carried on, not as a footnote, but as a light. He leaned back, looking at the sky, and thought of the last words she had spoken to him. Her hand frail, but her voice clear. Promise me he won't forget us. At the time, he had believed she meant Daniel. But now he understood. She had meant the world. She wanted their love, their work, their lives to leave a mark. And it had. Through the foundation, through the scholarships, through the research, she had not been forgotten. She had been multiplied. The church bells rang faintly in the distance, carried on the wind. James stood, brushing the grass from his trousers, and placed his hand once more on the stone. Thank you, Margaret, he said quietly, for everything, for the life we built, for the lessons, for reminding me that justice doesn't have to be cruel. He turned and walked back down the path, the daisies bright against the polished stone behind him. His shoulders no longer felt heavy. The man who had once staggered beneath grief had found his balance again. His legacy was no longer tied to a son who had squandered it, but to a wife who had honored it, and to a community that would carry it forward. As he reached the gate, he paused, looking back one last time at the headstone glowing in the sunlight. A faint smile touched his lips. For the first time since her passing, the silence did not hurt. It healed. Justice had been served, love had endured, and peace had returned. The reckoning was over, but the legacy was just beginning. Life has a way of teaching us that love without boundaries can turn into chains. James and Margaret gave everything they had to their son, time, money, and trust, believing sacrifice alone would build character. But sacrifice without accountability only bred entitlement, and entitlement eventually destroyed what love had built. The painful truth is that sometimes the people we raise or care for will choose their own path, even if it leads them away from us. What matters is how we respond. James chose not to drown in bitterness, but to turn betrayal into purpose, creating a legacy that honored his wife and lifted others. For those of us in our later years, this story is a reminder. Our value does not come from what others take from us, but from what we choose to give wisely and with intention. We are never too old to reclaim dignity, to draw boundaries, and to shape the future on our own terms. Justice may not come through confrontation alone. It can come through living with strength, clarity, and purpose. If this story resonates with you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to choose dignity over sacrifice?